Okay, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Great. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for coming and welcome to Black, White, and Red All Over, Addressing Newspapers in Collections. I'm Gillian Marcus. I'm DHPSNY's Preservation Specialist, and I'm here with Jennifer Palmentiero, who is the Digital Services Librarian at the Southeastern New York Library Resource Council, or CENULARC, for those of you who like acronyms. So we have a lot to cover today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So just a little bit about DHPSNY before we get on to the topic at hand. DHPSNY is a 5-year initiative in year 3 now to deliver essential training and services to New York's collecting institutions. DHPSNY services include archival needs assessments, preservation and conservation surveys, or condition surveys as we call them, guidance with strategic planning, and access to a variety of educational programs and workshops. DHPSNY is making these services available free of charge to New York-based organizations that collect, preserve, and make accessible historical records and/or library research materials, and that's you guys. DHPSNY is a collaboration between 2 long-running New York programs, the New York State Archives Documentary Heritage Program and the New York State Library Conservation Preservation Program. It was established in 2016 by the New York State Education Department's Office of Cultural Education to ensure consistent and comprehensive services to the vast network of organizations that safeguard New York's records and make them accessible. Okay. So this webinar is divided into 2 parts, and in the first part I'm going to talk about the physical nature of newspaper deterioration, what causes it, what steps we can take to preserve our physical newspaper collections, things like that. And then Jen is going to talk about the bigger picture on preserving the information contained in newspaper collections. She'll be talking about some of the choices you might face when you're evaluating whether to digitize your newspaper collections, digitization options, as well as presentation, storage, and access solutions. And we're hoping that at the end of this webinar, you might have a clearer picture of what the next steps will be in caring for your newspaper collections. We will also leave about a half hour for questions at the very end of this presentation because it's a big topic with a lot of information. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here if I can get my thing to work. There we go. So physical deterioration of your newspaper collection, along with a lack of space, is what usually leads institutions to begin worrying about what the future looks like for these materials. Newspapers tend to deteriorate in a very dramatic way. They look noticeably different, they can smell kind of stinky, and the edges often start crumbling off. They really sort of appear to self-destruct right in front of your eyes, which is scary. So first and foremost, I am here to tell you that it's not your fault. Actually, let me rephrase that. It may partly be your fault, which we'll get to later, but newspapers are often doomed to a life of physical deterioration from the beginning, starting with the way that they're made. Most of the paper that we encounter in our collections is made with cellulose fibers. Up until the 19th century, mid-19th century, I should say, the main source of cellulose in Western countries was cotton or linen rags, which are still used to this day to make rag paper. However, when the printing press was invented, the demand for an inexpensive and easily obtained source of paper material accelerated. Manufacturing for printed materials switched from rag paper to paper made with wood pulp. This happened around the 1860s, give or take a few years depending on the region. Rags tended to be scarce, and wood was a much easier material to source, but it produced paper which is of a much lower quality, and we'll talk about why that is in the next few slides. But essentially, for the last 160 years or so, give or take a bit, paper manufactured for inexpensive mass-produced items such as newspapers, cheap paperback books, and ephemera has often been made with wood processed through mechanical pulping. And by ephemera, I'm referring to items which were widely distributed materials that were often considered disposable, such as posters, flyers, pamphlets, tickets, receipts, etc., things like that. So one thing we need to remember is that these items weren't made to last and they were meant to be used. But as they've aged and we've begun to consider them historical objects that we want to keep for a long time, we've also seen that this material is inherently flawed. and newspapers are predisposed to physical deterioration. So aside from the material components of newspapers, there are many other things that can cause or accelerate their deterioration. This includes the way that they're manufactured, the presence of acidity, and that's both in the paper material itself and the environment, photolytic damage, which is light damage, exposure to poor storage materials and a poor storage environment, as well as improper handling. So we'll talk about each of these in more detail. Unfortunately, problems with newspaper stability often start with the tree that makes the paper, or trees that make the paper. So trees, along with many other plants, have lignin in them, which is the rigid material that keeps a growing plant upright and maintains its structure. By itself, lignin is not a harmful substance. In fact, it is essential for plants to grow and function. It's no more harmful to plants than our skeleton is to us. However, when wood is manufactured into wood pulp to make paper, that's when lignin becomes problematic. Mechanically pulping paper produces very short fibers, and it doesn't remove the lignin which is naturally present in the wood. Short fibered papers are not as durable as long fibered papers, which predisposes short fibered papers to be weaker and less durable than longer fibered papers. And an example of a longer fibered paper would be that cotton rag paper. Those are usually very long fibered papers. There is a process called chemical pulping, which does remove the lignin in some wood-based papers, but newspapers are almost always made using mechanically pulped papers. So why is lignin so harmful in paper? Lignin is actually made up of a variety of compounds, so it's not just one compound. They're generally three-dimensional polymers that contain carboxylic acid that are released as the lignin ages, which accelerates cellulose deterioration. This chemical reaction is called acid hydrolysis, and it breaks the molecular bonds which hold cellulose fibers together. So without that strong bond, this results in hard, brittle paper that disintegrates easily, which is often what you're looking at when you are thinking about your newspapers looking bad in your collections. In addition, beginning in the 1820s until around about the 1980s, alum rosin sizing was added to the paper pulp to reduce absorbency and minimize bleeding of inks. This alum rosin sizing generates sulfuric acid when exposed to moisture or high humidity. So acidity, both inherent and in the environment, is a huge contributor to the degradation of newspapers. Just in case anyone watching this doesn't know what I mean when I refer to acidic substances, I'm referring to a pH of around 6.5 or lower, generally 6 or lower. We've talked about sources of acids such as lignin and acid hydrolysis, as well as acidity from alum rosin sizing added to paper during manufacture. But paper can also absorb sulfur and nitrogen oxides from the environment, particularly in areas that have a lot of pollution or poor filtration in your HVAC system. So if you look at the edges of the text block on a cheap paperback book or on bound volumes of newspapers, often those edges will be darker or more yellow. And this is a pretty strong visual reminder that the edges of text blocks tend to absorb sulfur and nitrogen oxides from the environment before the center of the paper. Handling, by researchers, by staff, can also leave traces of lactic acid, which is a component of sweat. Nice. And oxidation is another chemical degradation pathway, and this is often initiated by light. So newspapers will often yellow as they age, as we've seen, and this is partly due to increasing acidity, but it is also the result of light-induced oxidation. As lignin absorbs light and decomposes, it can turn yellow. It's quite a complicated chemical process. Light, both visible and UV, also acts as an accelerator for existing degradation processes. So any existing deterioration will be made worse when light exposure is added. Exposure to high levels of visual light, that's visible light, not visual light, and ultraviolet radiation can also cause fading of colored newspapers. For example, the Financial Times, if you've ever seen that, which is kind of a light pink color. So to sum up, newspapers are prone to deterioration from the moment that they're made. And by the time they get to our collections, they're usually well on their way to deteriorating. But the environment that newspapers are in also contributes to deterioration, and that's bad news. But it's also good news because it's something that we have at least a little bit of control over, and we can do something about it. So that's good. We like to have control over our collections. And the things that we can really control in our collections are temperature, relative humidity, pollution in the environment, pest and mold damage, and light exposure. And we'll talk about each one of those in a little more detail now. So generally, the recommended temperature range for mixed media collections is around 59 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you can aim for something in that range, that's a positive step. However, the colder, the better for newspaper storage, because colder temperatures help to slow down some of those chemical reactions that we talked about in the first few slides. Ideally, relative humidity should be kept between 30 to 40%. But again, for mixed media collections, which I'm assuming most people have, very few people have just a straightforward newspaper collection. You can keep the relative humidity between 45 to 55%, give or take around 5%, and that's acceptable. The most important thing you want to avoid is rapid fluctuations of more than 10% in a 24-hour period. That's when you start really stressing the material. Obviously, the best way to maintain these standards is with a good HVAC system, but I realize that many places do not have the funding or infrastructure to install and maintain an HVAC system. And in that case, there are some supplementary things that you can use. It's really important that even if you don't have an HVAC system, and actually, especially if you don't have an HVAC system, that you track temperature and relative humidity using independent data loggers. This allows you to monitor trends in the environment your collections are in order to take steps toward environmental control. Funders are especially appreciative of this data because it shows that you're invested in the long-term care of your collections and that you know what's going on. There are so many data loggers on the market these days, from basic models with an LCD screen to models which can send environmental data to your phone or computer wirelessly, which is great. Data loggers are also fairly inexpensive. They're really one of the best investments any institution can take toward preservation of your collections, in my opinion. Even without an HVAC system, there are several supplementary methods that you can use to control the environment, and this includes standalone dehumidifiers and window air conditioning units. These things are especially important in the summer, but can also help if you have a space which has stagnant air or humid conditions year-round. Sometimes dehumidifiers can be labor-intensive. Some have to be emptied regularly, sometimes a couple of times a day, but they really can make a huge difference to the environmental quality of your storage areas, particularly without that HVAC system. There are other more passive measures you can take to control the relative humidity and temperature in collection spaces. And this can be as simple as making sure that compact storage shelves are staggered so that pockets of stagnant air do not form on the shelves. It can also mean bringing in fans, making sure that windows are properly sealed, during the winter, things like that. There are always sort of low cost or free methods you can use, and often they're pretty simple. Pollution both in the collection environment and inside of housing can also impact the longevity of newspapers. Sulfur and nitrogen oxides in the atmosphere are acidic and cause newspaper to become darker, yellower, and more brittle. We recommend that if you have an HVAC system or are planning to install an HVAC system in the future, that it has a good particulate or gaseous filtration system and that the filters are changed regularly. That's really important because a lot of debris, dust, things like that get trapped in there, and those are a big source of pollution. Housekeeping, especially regular dusting and vacuuming, is really, really important. Again, a low cost or free thing you can do that will, significantly improve the environment. Dust can contain all sorts of things which are harmful to collections materials. Pollution damage can also be exacerbated by keeping newspapers in a plastic box or in sealed plastic bags. So those acidic degradation products which are created as the newspaper deteriorates then become contained, which creates what we call a microclimate. So have you ever seen like a crowded subway car with lots of people where the windows begin to get fogged up from everyone breathing? That's an example of a microclimate. Maybe kind of a dramatic example, but something similar is happening with your newspapers when you seal them up in plastic. And it's a vicious cycle that you want to avoid by enclosing newspapers in material that keeps acidic byproducts trapped in the space. So I see quite a few newspapers kept in those sort of Rubbermaid Tupperware containers. And I know that it's well intentioned, but those can often cause problems. Pest damage, excuse me, and mold damage are two other common issues collections face with newspaper, particularly if there's poor or minimal housekeeping in collection storage areas. Mold is an unfortunate byproduct of a leak, a flood, or very humid conditions. At a minimum, having a solid housekeeping plan in place and dusting and vacuuming in storage areas will help to avoid a pest infestation. It's also recommended that all institutions have an integrated pest management or IPM plan in place. We do have some resources on the DHPSNY website, including a webinar on how to start and manage an IPM plan and on dealing with a mold outbreak in your collections. Apologies for that. As we mentioned previously, light, both visible and UV, causes damage and discoloration of newspapers. Having the appropriate storage, which we'll talk about in a little bit, will help to minimize light damage. It's also a good idea to block out windows and storage areas excuse me, with blinds, curtains, or some other material, and to make sure that lights are only turned on in storage when items are being retrieved. You can cover windows and light fixtures with UV filtering film and sleeves, which will drastically reduce UV exposure for items in storage. Excuse me, pardon me. Both UV filtering film and sleeves for light fixtures can be found in most preservation supply houses, including Gaylord, University Products. I think Hollander Metal Edge has some as well. So they're really easy to find. You can actually even find them on eBay and Amazon, places like that. One of the best ways that you can protect your newspaper collections is to store them properly using materials that can help to reduce or buffer acidic byproducts. You also want to choose appropriate storage furniture and take precautions when you're handling your collections. Here are a couple of anonymous examples that I've seen of newspaper storage that's problematic, and I'm not pointing fingers at all because I've seen this in lots and lots of places. Big institutions, small institutions, it happens. And part of the problem is that newspaper collections tend to be very large and newspapers themselves are really bulky, right? So they take up a lot of space, which means that they're problematic items to store. And space is almost always tight at collecting institutions. So this stuff happens. I often see newspapers in acidic folders or in no folders at all, stacked on top of one another pretty much as high as you can go. You can see that in that photo on the right there. Often newspapers will overhang the shelving that they're on, which can cause warping and weaken the newspaper, and it can make it more easily damaged if someone just brushes against it or falls off. Those brittle edges are really easily detached or crumbled just from slight movement. And if you have a lot of newspapers, chances are you've seen those little newspaper crumbs, those sort of edges all over the floor, probably all over the shelves as well. I also see newspapers rolled up and stored in flat files or in cardboard boxes or plastic bins. When newspapers are stored rolled up like this, they can become extremely difficult to open again as the paper becomes brittle with age. Or if they're exposed to very low humidity, that also makes them brittle. So looking at the example on the left there, those newspapers, they're in pretty bad shape. They will most likely require humidification and further conservation treatment to open and access them, which can be expensive and time-consuming. And it looks like so many pieces have broken off that, to be honest, putting them back together to get any information from them is going to be really, really difficult. And again, as I just mentioned, storing newspapers in a plastic bin is also creating that, that microclimate that we want to avoid. So in general, I recommend that unbound newspapers are stored in acid-free, lignin-free buffered folders. The term buffered means that it has an alkaline reserve, which helps to offset some of that acidic deterioration, some of those acidic byproducts. Putting those folders in a drop front or drop side archival box with a lid means that they're further protected from physical damage, and it means that they can be more safely stored on a shelf without worrying about edges being knocked off, things like that. There are kits that you can buy from Gaylord and other archival preservation supply outlets, and some of them come with polyethylene bags. I don't really love storing newspapers in plastic bags because of that microclimate issue I mentioned earlier. But one way around this is to make sure that it isn't sealed on all sides, and by putting a piece of buffered acid-free and lignin-free paper or cardstock in there for support and just for a little bit of alkalinity. But you don't really want to seal that newspaper in on all four sides. If you have lots of newspapers, folding them in appropriate folders and then storing multiple newspapers in a large acid-free, lignin-free storage box is probably the best solution, although it can make getting to individual papers slightly more difficult. And it will provide, both support and it will help to keep them protected. Bound newspapers should be stored the way that oversized books are. If they're smaller and they fit vertically on a shelf, then they should be kept upright. You do want to use bookends to support them, and you should avoid allowing them to slump against one another or against the edges of the shelf, which can cut into them. If the volumes are large, and a lot of bound newspaper volumes tend to be really, really large, you do want to store them horizontally on a shelf, and stacked no more than 3 high. So you don't want to, have 6 or 7 on top of each other, because that will put pressure on the lower newspapers. If the binding is falling apart or they're unstable, they can be put into an archival book box. Or you can also tie them together with cotton twill tape, or wrap the volume in acid-free, lignin-free paper. Ideally, you should have metal shelving systems for archival storage with large enough shelves, but sometimes you do work with what you've got. You might have wood shelving, for example, and wood can be problematic in that it can off-gas or expose items to other pollutants through varnishes, paints, etc., things like that. But this risk can be minimized by putting a buffer material, even something as simple as a piece of blotter or mylar, on the shelf. Or simply making sure that the newspapers are stored in boxes or folders so that they're not directly against that wood. If you do store newspapers in flat files, you want to make sure that they're folded rather than just in there loose in those drawers, and that the drawer is deep enough so that the edges of the newspapers don't catch as you're closing it. I see that quite a bit. It happens when people are shutting drawers that newspapers will get sort of jammed in the back. And often by the time you realize it's happening, they've kind of already gotten crunched up. A lot of the damage newspapers face comes from poor handling, both in the past and in their lives now as archival objects that need care. We have to remember that newspapers were originally meant to be looked at and then tossed. So many newspapers, even ones that were saved as special items, have been folded or squished or rolled up. They've been torn, they've had things torn out of them. Newspapers which were bound can suffer damage to the binding as a result of poor storage or bad handling, or simply age. What we can control now is how these items are handled when they get to us. And this starts with how staff handle them and extends to teaching visitors and researchers the best way to handle them. When things become so fragile that handling them becomes destructive, that might mean making the decision to not allow, losing my voice, to not allow an item to be handled. Ideally, though, you do want to consider digitization options before items are so damaged that they can't be handled. A sort of funny effect has been observed, and that's that the more something is digitized, the more materials are digitized, often the more researchers and visitors will want to see them in person, because they may not have known it was there. They may see it and think, wow, that's really amazing. I'd like to actually see that for myself. And sometimes people really, really just want to touch the real thing, particularly people who aren't as comfortable with computers. So starting a digitization program while your items are still strong enough to be handled is also important because they need to be handled enough to photograph during digitization projects. And digitization and conservation both require a lot of object handling. Ironically, they're designed to save the object, but they do require a lot of handling themselves. Good handling practices should be maintained by both staff and by researchers and visitors, and staff should feel comfortable with telling visitors how to handle materials correctly. Often incorrect handling only occurs because people haven't been shown the right way to do it. Bound newspapers should be supported using a book cradle or a book pillow while they're being consulted by researchers. And you can make an inexpensive book pillow out of Tyvek filled with poly beads or another soft material. Really easy, very cheap. Newspaper edges should be turned slowly and carefully, making sure not to turn the pages from that very, very edge, which do tend to be the most brittle and fragile areas of the newspapers. And when transporting unbound newspapers, they should be kept in a rigid folder, box, or in a cart so that they do have enough support to keep them from flopping over. And of course, you do want to make sure that the work or consulting space is large enough to accommodate the newspaper once it's unfolded or open, and that the edges don't hang over the side of the table or desk. And this is also important during processing. You or your institution may want to also think about having a good handling policy in place which outlines what is and isn't allowed in the reading room and storage spaces. This can cover food and drink, how to hold materials, how using a pencil instead of a pen, and correct methods of holding and consulting fragile materials. And it's kind of nice to have that policy, well, for many reasons, but it does allow you to, if you do have a visitor or researcher who's, maybe a little bit resistant to your handling suggestions, you can refer them to the policy. And some institutions actually have visitors sign the bottom of the policy stating that they've read what it contains. So there are times where good storage and handling are just not going to cut it, and more drastic interventive action needs to take place. It's pretty rare for newspapers to undergo conservation treatment, particularly since digitization has become so widespread, but it's not unheard of, especially for very important, rare, or valuable individual newspapers. There are a few things that conservators can do to treat damaged newspapers. It used to be fairly common for conservators to perform deacidification treatments, in which the pH of the newspaper is adjusted by a treatment which introduces an alkaline agent. You may have seen sprays such as Bookkeeper's Friend in preservation supply catalogs, but conservators don't generally promote using them since they can be hard to use correctly and they can also age in unexpected ways. So if you do see those things that promise mass deacidification treatments like Bookkeeper's Friend, you do want to avoid those because they don't always turn out the way that you would like. But a paper conservator can use other methods to raise that pH in the newspaper. That's a little bit more complicated to explain, but it's definitely doable. Newspaper clippings can also be lined. Conservators can mend tears on papers. If you do have something that you want treated, the American Institute for Conservation has a helpful feature called Find a Conservator, where you can enter the type of material that you want treated and your location to find a list of paper conservators near you. And you can always email me if you have questions about this. AIC has just changed their website, so it is culturalheritage.org, and from there's a link that will show you how to enter the Find a Conservator area. Framing an especially valuable clipping using a sealed package with zeolites or other molecular traps is another option, particularly if you want to display something, if you have a particular newspaper or newspaper clipping that you would like to put on exhibition. This creates a healthy microclimate for an item, and the molecular traps help to remove pollution from the environment within the frame. Lining a box with microchamber paper, which has zeolites, is another way to do this. It also slows down fluctuations in relative humidity and temperature inside of that sealed package. And finally, if you have something incredibly special, valuable, important, or otherwise, you can store a newspaper in cold storage. You want to follow instructions for correctly packaging it so that you don't have condensation in the packaging. And there are a number of really good resources online for packaging items for cold storage. And you can also email me with questions if that is something that you want to do. So before I turn you over to Jen, I'm just going to quickly sum up what we talked about today. Ideally, you do want to keep the environment stable with minimal fluctuations in temperature and relative humidity. And you also want to avoid light exposure. You want to avoid sealing newspapers in plastic boxes or bags, which can create an unwanted microclimate. You do want to take care when handling newspapers. Watch for brittle edges. Take care when unfolding stiff or brittle materials, things that don't feel like they want to yield. That maybe that's something you don't want to force. And you do want to have a good handling policy in place for researchers and visitors. So newspaper dues. Keep independent data loggers in every space collections are used, stored, and exhibited. That's just good practice generally. You want to use supplementary dehumidifiers or air conditioning units when needed, for example, during the summer, if you don't have a good HVAC system or an HVAC system at all. You want to practice good housekeeping, including regular dusting. And you want to use appropriate supportive storage materials that are buffered to help mitigate damage stemming from the inherent acidity of newspapers. Newspaper don'ts. Don't let newspapers overhang a shelf or a table. Don't store newspapers rolled up for long periods of time or really at all. It would be a good thing to avoid rolling them up at all. Don't store newspapers in areas with high temperatures or relative humidity or rapidly fluctuating temperatures or relative humidity. If you if you know you have a basement with a problem with dampness, probably don't want to store your newspapers down there. And again, you don't want to put them in a sealed plastic container or an acidic cardboard box. So if you have any questions about anything that I've talked about, we will have time at the end of the webinar. We're leaving quite a bit of time after Jen's part of the presentation. You can also email me at gmarcus@dhpsny.org. I'm always happy to help. No question is too stupid or too weird. So send them in. And as a reminder, this webinar will be available on DHPSNY's website. So now I'm going to turn you over to Jennifer Palmentiero to talk about digital solutions for your newspaper collections. Take it away, Jen. Are you online?
Can you hear me? I think
yes.
I am. Can you hear? Okay,
Awesome.
great. And thank you so much, Gillian, for that awesome information. I certainly learned a lot. I don't know much about the physical side of things, being a digital librarian, but that was quite a science lesson. So thank you for that. And yes, now I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation talking about reformatting newspapers, focusing primarily on digitization. Thank you, Gillian, for advancing my slide. So first, before we get started, just a little bit about who I am and where I'm coming from. So there is a face to go with the voice for the rest of this session. And I am the Digital Services Librarian at the Southeastern New York Library Resources Council. We are one of 9 multi-type library systems that comprise the Empire State Library Network. If you aren't familiar with Southeastern or CNELRC, represented in the tan on the map in the beautiful Hudson Valley, you might be familiar with your regional council. Empire State Library Network councils provide a variety of services to libraries and cultural heritage organizations in New York. And for over 10 years, my council has coordinated a regional, meaning Hudson Valley, related newspaper digitization project as part of our suite of digitization services. I've been very involved in that project since the beginning. I've certainly learned a lot over the last 10 years, and I hope to share some of that with you today. Our sister council in Northern New York, up in the light blue there, the Northern New York Library Network, they have been coordinating a statewide newspaper digitization service for probably about as long as we've been in operation down in the Hudson Valley. And so I'll be sharing a little bit more about those 2 services later in this presentation, because those are certainly options you can explore for providing access to your newspapers. First, just a little bit about microfilming, because newspaper digitization is really popular in libraries and cultural heritage organizations, but there are costs to doing it well. And if you'd like to digitize from your newspaper collections and you don't yet have the funds secured to do that, and the paper you want to digitize or papers you want to digitize haven't already been microfilmed, microfilming could be an important and affordable first step. Digitizing from microfilm is less expensive than digitizing from paper, so microfilming as a first step will save you money in the long run, as opposed to doing a massive digitization project from all paper. And film is still one of the best preservation formats we have, and so film doesn't exist yet for a paper. It's a smart move to get it filmed. If you decide to microfilm, you want to work with a reputable vendor that follows microfilming standards and guidelines. And if you don't know yet if your paper has been filmed, you can check the New York State Library website. They have a whole space on their website dedicated to something called the New York State Newspaper Project. For I think over 20 years or about 20 years, the State Library coordinated a massive newspaper microfilming project. And you can search and browse this website in a number of ways, by title, by county, by city, I think, to see what has been filmed and where film is located. And you can request duplicates through the State Library's reference services as well. Okay, we'll be talking a little bit more about film later, specifically how to evaluate film during a selection process for digitization. So more on film later. But let's talk about newspaper digitization projects and all the things you need to think about before you embark on such an adventure. Again, I'm going to talk primarily about digitizing and from microfilm because that is the most likely scenario. Digitizing from paper provides really good results, but again, it is more expensive. And some big newspaper projects will likely include starting from some paper, either to fill in some gaps in a run, or perhaps there is a title that hasn't yet been filmed. So you might be working with some paper, but again, I do recommend getting that paper filmed. Microfilm created today by vendors who follow all the standards is really good, and you'll get really good results if the source paper is in good condition. Okay, before you actually do anything, plan and plan some more. Consider the entire project and all its steps before you actually send your film out to be digitized. You want to communicate with your stakeholders. Those are your coworkers, your community, your board, potential funders, and collaborators. And talk to people who've done this before. There's a lot of folks in the state who have digitized newspapers. So get in touch with them, find out how they did it, what vendors did they use, how was their experience, what did they learn, if they had to do it all over again, would they do anything differently? Talk to your peers and document everything. Document the steps you took, document your evaluation process. We're going to talk about evaluating microfilm and paper, and you're going to want to document your choices. Your successors will be very thankful that you did that. And make a plan. Write a plan for yourself. All right, so let's talk about planning for a little while. Okay, when planning a newspaper project, you want to think about who you are doing this for, why you are doing it, what papers will be digitized, who is going to do the work, and how you will store, manage, preserve, and provide access to the digitized newspapers, and of course, how you will pay for it. These questions should be answered and documented in a written project plan. I'm going to unpack each of these bullet points for you a little bit as I go along. So let's start with selection. Selection is a really important step for any digitization project. You might not need or want to digitize every title or every reel of microfilm in your collection. So I recommend thinking about your audience and defining a primary audience if you can. This isn't always easy to do. There's certainly a lot of different audiences that can benefit from digitized newspapers, but you might have one in mind already. So some things to consider when you're thinking about audience. The type of user. Are you looking to serve primarily genealogists or the K-12 community, higher ed students and faculty, or researchers more broadly? That's one way to think about audience. Another way to think about audience is by their location. Are you concerned primarily with your local community of users right now and supporting them before all others? Is providing access only in your building enough? Or do you want to support users who can't travel to your building? If you do plan to put the newspapers online, do you want the text of the newspapers to be indexed by search engines so that anyone can find the content, whether or not they know about your organization and your newspaper project? Do you want the papers to be freely available online, or are you okay with putting them behind a paywall? The answers to these questions will affect your decision making, specifically what titles you select and how you provide access. So think about that for a little while, because not all newspaper projects are created the same. There are lots of different ways to go about this. So think about who you're trying to serve so that you can best meet their needs. So a little audience anecdote for you. We have a local county genealogical society. So guess who their primary audience is? Genealogists and themselves to support their own research. They have very limited resources. So what they decided to do was they digitized over 50 years worth of an annual supplement that was published in their paper of record. So every year on either December 31st or January 1st, this pretty big substantial regional paper published this supplement, and in the supplement were all of the year's marriages and deaths and other local happenings, the events, the arrests, the business dealings, accidents, fires, injuries, etc. So it provides a really valuable resource for genealogy research without having to digitize the daily paper. It was a really brilliant strategy. Over 50 years worth of these supplements they digitized, and it didn't cost them all that much, relatively speaking. So again, supporting genealogy research was their primary audience and goal, and doing this was just a great resource. Now, also in these supplements is a whole like kind of year in review of both international and national news. So that is also, you know, as a secondary audience, the K-12 community could probably really benefit from those supplements. All right, so let's move on to content. So get to know the content of your collection. In terms of selecting a title, that might be done for you already. You might just have one paper of record in your community, so it's one and done. But if you do have multiple titles to choose from, you want to evaluate them for a number of things, including content. If you have a defined audience, you will want to select titles with the content that meets their needs. What is most important or useful to them? Do they want mostly like that hyper-local news, or more regional or state or national, or some combination of all of them? Different titles really kind of have some different content, and so it's a good idea to look through and see what you're working with. Another thing to think about is what's most requested now among your user community, and start there. So you absolutely have to consider copyright when you're going through the selection process. Papers published pre-1924, so that's 1923 and earlier, are in the public domain and can be digitized without seeking permission. Before copyright laws changed in the 1980s and granted copyright to any new work of authorship fixed in a tangible medium, there were certain formalities that had to be met in order to obtain and renew copyright. If those formalities were not met by newspaper publications and publishers, then you may indeed be free and clear to digitize them. But I would recommend getting some legal counsel before you do. Several of our contributing organizations have worked with lawyers to move beyond the 1924 mark. Okay, another thing you can consider is talking to publishers if they are still in business. They have been known to grant permission in some cases. Even if you are digitizing only public domain papers, it's a nice courtesy to let publishers know you are doing it. They might give you some press when your collection is available online. We've had that experience in the past as well. Okay, so you want to think about quantity. Looks like some of my slides look a little weird. I don't know if everyone's seeing that or not, but I'll just talk and fill in the blanks. So quantity, how long of a run do you have access to? Is it better to digitize a long run of one title than scatterings of multiple titles? That's just something to think about. Another way to think about quantity is the daily versus the weekly. Is there enough content in a weekly paper to meet the needs of your users? You can get more bang for your buck digitizing a weekly versus a daily. And you also want to think about quality. And this is really key to the selection process and the evaluation process. You want to evaluate the features and the quality of the source paper and the quality of the microfilm. And you can do some of this at the same time by looking at service copies of microfilm. When it comes to digitizing, you do want to digitize from negative microfilm. More on that in a minute, but you can learn a lot by looking at positive service copies. In terms of paper quality, is there a lot of bleed through? Kind of weird fonts? Is the text real squishy in columns? Is there not a lot of space around it? Just some things to look for. Was the paper deteriorating when it was filmed? Gillian just gave us a lot of information and a lot of images to look at of kind of film of paper in bad shape, and sometimes the paper was filmed that way, so there could be holes and tears, folds and creases, and other damage that can interfere with creating good images and good searchable text. Another thing to notice when you're looking at service copies is if the paper was bound when it was microfilmed, there could be gutter shadows or page curvatures, or poor and uneven focus, within a page or within a reel. So you want to look for those kinds of features. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but during the reformatting process, searchable text is generated from the digitized images through a process called optical character recognition. And kind of poor quality source material, either the paper and or the film, could affect the ability to make the paper searchable. So, and it may be that you don't have any other choice. This may be the best it's going to get, especially if the original papers had a lot of damage and deterioration. Then that it is what it is. But just know what you're going to get, and that could affect some of the decisions you make and how much you spend to digitize and provide access if you're not going to get very good searchable results at the end of the day. Another thing to think about as you're evaluating the service copies is, do you notice were the papers filmed in chronological order? That can be an issue, so you'll want to document that so that you can communicate that with a vendor. Another thing we noticed when we were doing these projects is sometimes with daily papers there was a morning edition and an evening edition, and sometimes when they were filmed, they only filmed the unique content of the evening edition. So let's say the last few pages were all ads and the ads were the same in both editions. They might not have filmed those ads for the evening edition, and only the first couple pages where the content was different. So you want to notice those things so that you can communicate with the vendor around that and how you want to handle that. All right, so we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into kind of the quality issue and talk a little bit about microfilm evaluation. The better you know the nature and quality of your microfilm, the more successful your project will be. And you'll be able to communicate with vendors effectively if you know what kind of film you're sending them. And again, document all of this. I recommend either having like forms or some kind of spreadsheet where as you're going through reels, and if you have a really large collection, you will probably not evaluate every reel. But the reels that you do evaluate, you might want to keep track of some of these characteristics. Okay, the first one is image orient. Well, let me run down this list for you. So we're going to talk about image orientation. We're going to talk about film generation and polarity. That's whether it's positive or negative. The film type, the reduction ratio, the density, and the focus. So image orientation, this is what we're talking about. So how was it filmed? How are the images on the film? Sometimes they were shot, 2 pages together, as you can see here. So ideally, you would want film that's either the 1A or the 1B, where you just have 1 page per frame. They also tend to be larger images. 1A is probably ideal. You probably get the best results with that. And it's usually referred to as 1-up or 2-up, and sometimes vendors might ask you that, whether you have 1-up or 2-up, and that means whether it's 1 page per frame or 2 per frame. And another reason you want to know this is because some vendors will charge a per page processing fee. So if you're looking at your microfilm and you see that you actually have 2 pages in one shot, you're gonna need to double your page count so you can give them an accurate number of how many pages you're sending them and know what it's going to cost you. Okay, and this is an important one. As I mentioned, you're going to want to ideally digitize from a master negative, and it's usually a second generation master negative. You wouldn't want to digitize off the first generation, but you try to avoid a service copy, even if it hasn't been run through a reader, because it is the more generations you go, there's some quality loss. It kind of loses some focus. So your print master negative, that second generation, is ideally what you'd want to do. So if you can find who has a master negative, if you don't have one in your collection, and get that duplicated, then that is what you'll want to send to a vendor. I do highly recommend avoiding service copies that have been run through readers, because they get scratched, and those scratches will show up on the digital images, and they will affect the ability to generate good searchable text off those images. So your film base types, polyester is recommended, and that's ideally what you want to use. It's more durable, and it is recommended for scanning. It started being used in the mid-1980s, so older film created before them is likely acetate. You ideally want to duplicate acetate reels onto polyester before scanning. Acetate is prone to deterioration, warping, curling, buckling, and it can also be brittle, so it can tear during digitization. If your film smells like vinegar, it is acetate, and it means it's deteriorating, so you're going to want to try to save that first and get that information off of that acetate film and onto polyester film. Okay, I don't know much about film, but I've heard from some people who do, and many of you out there who work in libraries and have film collections probably know better than I, that if you pull a few inches of film out and it curls, it is likely acetate. And so then the emulsion types. Silver halide is preferred. Diazo is a bluish tone, and it is used on surface copies. But if you get, I just want you to know about this a little bit, because if you order duplicates of microfilm, sometimes you have a choice of silver halide or diazo, and diazo might cost you a little less, but you want to go for the silver halide. Ideally, if you're getting film duped, you want it duped from that master negative, and you want a second generation silver halide polyester negative to digitize. Okay, reduction ratio is important when you're evaluating film. The reduction ratio should be identified on preservation quality microfilm, and lower is better. If you can find an 8x to 14x, that's great. What you're most likely to find is the 15x to 24x, and experts in the field say 20 or lower is preferred for newspaper digitization. And the reduction ratio is the size of the filmed image compared to the size of the original document, and it's generally referred to with an X, so 12x represents the reduction ratio of 12 to 1, which means that the size of the image on the film will be 1/12 of the size of the actual paper. And just one more thing about microfilm evaluation, and I considered not including this slide because to truly measure and evaluate the density and resolution requires some equipment that you are likely to not have in your library or organization. But I want you to know about it because it is important to what you're going to get, the results you're going to get. So density is the numerical measurement of contrast between the image and the non-image background of the microfilm, or essentially it's the measurement of light able to pass through the film. And if the density is too light or too dark, contrast is compromised and focus problems become more apparent. And there is actually, a little machine called a densitometer that actually you can use on the film to measure that. And then with resolution, again, master, preservation microfilm should have resolution targets on it, and then you're supposed to use a microscope to kind of look at those and see what your resolution and your focus is like. That's probably not something we can do, but just I wanted to let you know that contrast and focus could be issues. So as you're evaluating service copies, just look for kind of differences in contrast. You can tell if the contrast is too low, if the text is very light on the background, and that could affect, again, the quality of the images you produce and the OCR text. Consistency and density is more important. I mean, ideally you want good contrast, but if you have a whole reel that's kind of low, that is something you can tell a vendor and they can adjust for that. It's just harder to adjust when the density is, and then there's a variation within one reel. So again, consistency is what you're going for if you can't necessarily have it be ideal in a reel. So now we're going to look at a couple examples of what you could get from microfilm. You could end up with images that look like this, or like this, or like this. Here's another one, and one more. Here's an issue of contrast not being ideal. And so all of these images that I showed you could produce searchable text that looks like this, if you even get this many letters out of it. Sometimes it can't read anything at all. Sometimes you just get a bunch of special characters when you're running those images through that optical character recognition process. So I just want you to know, kind of garbage in, garbage out. It's really true with newspaper digitization when you're working with older film. And you will likely have some of these quality issues in any mass digitization project you're going to do with newspapers. But at least you know what to expect from the results. And you should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good when it comes to newspaper digitization. It's really unavoidable to deal with some of this. Unless you're starting with really good quality paper and creating really good quality film and then digitizing from that, then you'll get pretty darn good results. But you're going to end up with some text that looks like this. In any project you have. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the digital reformatting kind of things to think about, specifications, file formats, without going into too much detail, because newspaper digitization is not like digitizing postcards or photographs or other things in your collection. And I personally recommend outsourcing rather than trying to do a mass digitization project in-house with newspapers. If you're a small organization with limited resources, it's best to leave this work to the professionals who already have the hardware and software necessary to produce searchable newspapers. But here are just some things to consider. Typically, 300 to 400 PPI, that's your scanning resolution, is what most vendors are going to produce. 400 is kind of the gold standard. That's not always achievable. If you have a really high reduction ratio, then they might have to go down to 300. And some shops, 300 is their go-to. But that's about what you can expect in terms of the scanning resolution. In terms of file formats, there are kind of different flavors for these kinds of projects and what gets produced at the end of the day. Some vendors or service providers, at the end of the day, you get a searchable PDF, and that's what you get. Some processes produce all three of these file formats. You get TIFFs for kind of your master archival format of your digital images that you can then, do something with later. And then they might produce what's called a JPEG 2000 for viewing online, and a searchable PDF. So sometimes all three are produced, sometimes one, sometimes two. There's differences, but just so you can kind of know how to communicate with vendors about what their process is and know what you want at the end of the day. One thing to consider is bitonal versus grayscale scanning. Bitonal means that the resulting images are pure black and white. There's no shades of gray in between. The only colors represented on the image are black and white. We're going to talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. So I'll go into a little more detail about that in a minute. And then there's always an optical character resolution process through the reformatting. That's what makes the newspaper searchable. Oftentimes TIFFs are created to do the OCR, but then sometimes the TIFFs are not retained. The ending result is a searchable PDF. Again, sometimes if you're presenting, if your process presents JPEG 2000s online, then the OCR file is a separate file and they work together. And sometimes those presentations also have PDFs for downloading. Our processes here in Southeastern produce all 3 file formats, TIFF for kind of your master file, and then we present JPEG 2000s with an external OCR file and searchable PDFs online. So I want to mention here the NDNP, which stands for the National Digital Newspaper Program, because if you're out there exploring reformatting vendors, you will likely see on some of their websites that they can adhere to the NDNP specifications and standards. So the National Digital Newspaper Program is a joint program of the Library of Congress and the National Endowment for the Humanities. They've been doing this project for, probably 15 years now, give or take. And they have developed specifications for their projects. It's a grant program. Library of Congress takes care of the technical side of things, and the NEH funds these, and they are state level grants. Usually one institution in a state gets the grant to do to kind of coordinate a collaborative project within that state to digitize multiple newspapers. And they want all of their awardees to follow their specifications. So I just want you to know about them in case you're talking to vendors. And METS Alto are the metadata standards that are part of those specifications. So again, just so you can speak the language a little bit, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but METS stands for the Metadata Encoding and Transmission Standard, and it is used to record the structural metadata for a newspaper issue, and also can include some descriptive and administrative metadata. And then ALTO stands for Analyze, Layout, and Text Object, and it's the ALTO metadata record that holds the OCR and also encodes some other interesting information about what's going on a page. So text font styles and sizes are recorded, and where words are positioned on a page, and it also includes some information about columns and lines and things on the page. Again, I just want you to know this so when you go out and start talking to vendors, because you will see this on some of their websites. I was curious, because we work with some go-to vendors, but there are a lot more out there, a lot more than I realized. I hadn't looked in a while, and I did see that a lot of vendors say that they produce NDNP specs. So, and our process at Southeastern follows those specifications pretty closely. Okay, so I wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive into bitonal versus grayscale imaging, because this is important and I want you to know about it as you think about what you want to do and as you talk to vendors. Because some vendors do have a go-to, they might be more of a bitonal shop than a grayscale shop, and if you want grayscale images, you need to talk to them about that. Some, grayscale is their go-to. So as you can see here, scanning in grayscale will get you much better quality when it comes to images in your newspapers. So if you're dealing with more modern newspaper content that has a lot of photographs in it, you should really consider grayscale, because you'll lose something, as you can see here, if you do bitonal scanning. Another thing to consider is if you have low contrast on some of your film, and you're just doing black and white scanning, that bitonal scanning, you could also lose something in the text, because the machine's going to look at those letters and decide whether it's white or it's black, and that's your only choices. So if you don't have good contrast, you could get what's called dropout, where it's not going to capture the letter fully. You'll have like white splotches within your letters, and then you'll get bad OCR results. I have absolutely seen really good bitonal scans and good OCR. If you've got really good contrast in your film and not a lot of images, bitonal could be a great way to go. But I just want you to know the difference, and this is why evaluating what you have is really important when figuring out which mode you want to use. Okay, so let's talk about some options for getting this done. Now that we've talked all about how to make the best selection decisions, how can you do this and who can you work with? And there are a number of things you can do, lots of options out there. So as a representative of the Empire State Library Network, I need to tell you about what we're doing and how we can help you. So I'll start with our service here in the Hudson Valley. Again, this is just Hudson Valley related. So if you're in our service area, we cover, the 8 counties in the Hudson Valley, and we have worked with some Westchester organizations as well. We can certainly support you in doing newspaper digitization. We do use the Metz-Alto standards. Our process does produce the TIFFs, the JPEG 2000s, and the PDFs. And primarily how we support you is in the hosting. We license software called Viridian, and that is how we host our newspapers online. And we've also produced the specifications. So we do have a couple go-to vendors, but there are more vendors out there who can produce deliverables according to our specs, and we can kind of get you going and get you set up with vendors, and then we can provide the hosting for you. I just want to say here, because you're looking at this screenshot, if you see the register and login buttons, nothing is behind a paywall. Users do not have to create an account to use any of the content on our system. Users can create an account and they are free, and it just allows them to do some more things, primarily save their search results. They can save and annotate and create lists and email them to themselves and things like that. So that's all I'm going to say about that, because most of you are probably not in the Hudson Valley. So let's move on and talk about the statewide project that is coordinated by my sister council up in the North Country. Now they are kind of an A to Z shop. So while we do not, and my council, do any of the reformatting for you, the Northern New York Library Network does. So you can send them your microfilm and they'll provide an A to Z service for you. They do the scanning from microfilm only. I don't believe they work with paper. And I do think they outsource one small piece of the process, but they facilitate all of that on your behalf. So again, you just send them the film and they'll take care of the rest. They do charge for their reformatting services, but they don't have any fees for hosting right now. And you can work with other reformatting vendors, even if you want them to be your presentation solution, but I highly recommend that you contact them first and let them know that you want them to host, because they can point you to vendors that can produce the deliverables that they need that go kind of seamlessly into their system. And their website is also a good place to check to see if your papers have already been digitized. So you might want to start there and see what's been done and maybe how you can fill in some gaps if some of your papers are already there. And I do want to give a little shout out to Chuck Henry up there at the Northern New York Library Network. He and I spoke for about 30 minutes when I was preparing this presentation, and he has shared some nuggets of wisdom with you all through me today. So there are other options. There are quite a few. These are only some. So beyond working with us down in Southeastern or upstate. So one of my pieces of advice is, if you plan to work with multiple vendors or service providers, just as I mentioned, if you want your papers hosted up in the North Country, make sure you talk to your hosting service provider first. Because access systems have requirements for file formats, file naming conventions, directory structures, and metadata. So you want to make sure that your reformatting vendor can produce what is needed for your access system. So kind of start at the access and work backwards from there. And Viridian is the software that we use at Southeastern, and you could certainly work with them directly, and they can I don't think they do all the reformatting, but again, I do believe you could send them film and they can contract some pieces out, and then they can bring you up in a Viridian site for yourself. I'm seeing some messages that some sound is cutting out. Do I sound okay to everybody, or am I cutting out? Okay, then I'll just keep going. Okay, maybe it was on their end. All right. So the Internet Archive does host newspapers, and they also provide scanning. When I looked at their website, it said that it was a pilot project, but I believe it's been going on for quite a while. And I just checked recently, and there were some new newspapers uploaded just last week. So that could be an option for you. Advantage preservation is a big one. I know a lot of libraries and historical societies have worked with them. And then newspapers.com. Now that is one where you don't pay for any of the reformatting. They will reformat for you, but then your newspapers go behind a paywall. And I don't know much about it beyond that, like how much it would then cost you to license the database. Can you just subscribe to your paper, or do you have to subscribe to the whole database? I'm not sure, but I know that some libraries have gone that route as well. But if you are going to work with any of these folks or a combination of them, just some things to consider and some things to ask for. Can they produce a sample for you to review before committing? Some vendors will do this for little or no cost. It's worth asking. Send them a reel and let them work with it, especially if it's an A to Z shop. You know, if they can take your film and reformat it and provide a presentation solution for you, have them do a test for you before you sign anything. And what is their policy for dealing with bad film that won't produce good images or good OCR? Will they stop work and let you know, or do they just keep going? Some are kind and will stop and let you know, and some won't. So this is, again, why, you know, kind of doing your investigation and your evaluation is very helpful, because at least you can say to them, like, I know that these reels are not awesome, but it's all I have to work with. So the more you do your homework, the better off you're going to be. But ask them that, because maybe they'll stop if it's really bad. Is there a way to correct bad OCR within the system? Viridian does have that, and that's the software we use at Southeastern, and it's awesome, and it's a great way to crowdsource the correction of bad OCR. If the vendor provides online hosting and the contents of the papers are the contents of the papers indexed by search engines, the answer may be no, and if that's important to you, you should ask. I'm going to tell you a little story about that in a minute. So, and then find out what formats they produce. Do they produce TIFFs and then destroy them? Do you want them? Do you get searchable PDFs? Are there JPEG 2000s involved? Again, those are the three typical formats, and you just kind of want to know what kind of deliverables you're going to get at the end of that. And if they provide hosting, do you get a set of the files back? So you want to ask all these questions. So let's talk a little bit about, I just want to tell you a little story. So my friend Will, I was visiting Will about 6 months ago, and he lives down in New Rochelle in Westchester County in an historic housing neighborhood. It was one of the early gated communities. I don't know if in the state or the country, but pretty big community, not gated anymore, but it is a historic district. And he was telling me all about the history of his neighborhood and his home specifically. You know, there was a musician who lived there in the late 1800s who had a music school out of his house. I don't know, it was fascinating. He knew a lot. And I finally stopped and I asked him, I said, where did you learn all this information? And he said, old Scarsdale newspapers that he found online. And the Scarsdale Inquirer, the historic newspapers, happened to be in our site. So, of course, I had a big smile over that. And then when I was preparing for this presentation, I thought to ask him, you know, and I just saw him last weekend, and I said, hey, Will, I said, if you were doing those searches, because he found his way there through Google. He had a curiosity, and he was searching online and happened to have newspapers answer his questions. But I asked him, I said, if you had been presented with a paywall, like if you had done those searches, clicked on a result, and then it said, hey, you can look at this content for $9.99 a month and cancel your subscription at any time, would you have paid for that? And he said no. And if he had said yes, I would tell you. But again, this is just one person. It's just an anecdote. But, you know, it's a way to think about kind of those other users who may not be your primary users, and how newspapers can help them. And if you want to help someone like Will, because he would have never thought to go to the library a couple towns over, even to their website to see if they had newspapers there, or to go into the building. But he found them, and he was, thrilled with all of the information he found. And he told me he has bookmarked the site so that he can go back whenever he has another question he wants answered. So think about Will and in your decision-making process. And if that helps you make some decisions about how you can serve people with your newspapers. And again, there are lots of options here that you can explore, and we are here to help you at the Empire State Library Network. So give us a call and we can tell you all about what we do and how to think about some of these other options. So we need to talk about digital storage and preservation and kind of sustainability for a few minutes. So large newspaper projects produce massive amounts of files. As I mentioned, our process produces TIFFs and JPEG 2000s and PDFs of every page, and then also a PDF of every issue. That's a lot of files. If you will be receiving copies of all the files produced, you need to plan for the storage and preservation of those files and the sustainability of your project. What options are more sustainable and will keep you going? We don't know what the field is going to look like 10, 15, 20 years from now. So making decisions now that can, better ensure that you can move this forward through time is important. So following standards is important. The more standards-based your approach is, the better off you're going to be, because at some point everybody following those standards might have to move to the next thing, but there'll be a migration path and we'll kind of all be on it together. Digital media is very fragile and vulnerable, just like the paper, and files can be lost without proper management. So typically in the world of digital preservation, kind of digitized materials created from analog resources are a lower priority than born digital resources that are one of a kind, and if they're lost forever. You can always go back and scan the original again. That said, large newspaper projects come at considerable costs. If you spend $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 on a project, you really don't want to go back and have to do that again. So again, following standards, getting open, stable formats is really important. And then thinking about the policies, procedures, and the people necessary to ensure that those files are accessible in the long term. You might not have digital preservation policies and procedures in place right now, and that's okay. If you're going to embark on a project like this, now might be a good time to think about digital preservation more broadly in your organization. And guess what? There's a DHPSNY webinar for that. That has become my new catchphrase. There is a DHPSNY webinar for everything. I haven't watched it, but it is called, I believe, Digital Preservation for Small Repositories. So you might want to check that out if you're going to undertake a massive digitization project like that and get some good ideas for storing and managing and preserving those files over the long term. You might have some policies and procedures and staff dedicated to other kind of collection management things or disaster recovery kind of things that maybe you can insert these files you're going to get into some of those policies and procedures and responsibilities now, just to make sure that they're safe for the long term. Multiple copies is a really good idea. 2 is great, 3 is better. With 1 stored off-site, you might want to consider some cloud storage. There are certainly full-blown digital preservation services you can explore. They are very expensive, so maybe you scale up to something like that. But in the meantime, talk to your vendors, talk to your service providers. What can they do to help you, if anything? Some might have some add-on services or some good ideas or some strategies for you. So it's worth talking to them about all of this. All right, so let's talk a little bit about funding and how you can pay for all of this. These are just some scenarios that have worked in my region. Friends groups, if you're in public libraries, they've been incredibly supportive of these projects. I know several libraries that have gotten funding from their friends groups to pay for digitization of newspapers. I've also seen several collaborations and partnerships form. If multiple organizations within a community, even within one town or, at the county level could all benefit from the same titles being digitized, then pull your resources together and do a shared project. Some of my members have gotten support from their municipalities, their local governments, and also some county governments have helped support some of these projects. And then community fundraising has been very successful and helped fill in some of the gaps. You're probably not going to raise all the money you need for a newspaper project from your community, but it could be a way to get some funding. Local banks have been known to support these projects a little bit, not a lot, but every little bit helps. One of my member libraries had a successful Kickstarter campaign to raise some money to do a few years of a newspaper. So you could explore that option. There are other crowdfunding platforms that might work better for you. The Digital Public Library of America in 2 days is having a free webinar on using Kickstarter in libraries. So you might want to attend that. Because you could probably get some good tips for how to do crowd fundraising, even if you don't use Kickstarter as a platform. And likely you'll use some combination of all of these to get a project done. I didn't put grants on here because they're not easy to get for big newspaper projects. But that said, some of my sister councils do provide digitization grants, and they will provide grants for digitizing newspapers. I'm not sure which all of them that do versus don't, but if you are a member of your local Empire State Library Network Council, that could be a source of funding for you as well. So you want to explore that as an option. And also there's a new IMLS grant category specifically for small libraries, and they do have a community memory category within that. If you do a web search for IMLS small libraries community memory, it'll come right up. The deadline for this round was yesterday, so maybe plan for next year. Again, I don't know if they'll fund newspapers, but it's worth looking into. So those could be some possibilities for funding. And another thing to consider in terms of funding, because if you're looking to do a big project, it could really cost you a lot of money, but you don't have to do it all at once. Some vendors are very good about chunking the work for you. Like I have $5,000 to spend this year, and you can even send them all your film, but they'll stop when they hit that $5,000 mark. And then next year you send them another $5,000. There are some vendors who will work with you on that. So it's something to ask as you're communicating with them. And that's about all I have to say about funding. So let's just wrap it up where we started and think about, for a successful project, you're going to want to plan. You're going to want to communicate at all different levels, and you're going to want to document. I think a really important thing to document is that kind of evaluation and selection process. The more you know those reels of microfilm and have that all documented, the better you can communicate with your vendors. And you'll really save your successors a lot of time and not reinventing the wheel. They'll know why you didn't choose something and why you did choose something else. And have fun. And we're here to help you, so please do get in touch. And that's all I have, and I think we'll take questions now.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jen. If anyone has any questions, go ahead and type them in the box. The question for you, Jen.
Okay. So first generation is the generation, it's the original microfilm created from the paper. When the paper was filmed, the first roll of film is the first generation, and it tends to be a negative copy. So it's not a positive copy that you look at through your microfilm reader. It is negative. And then the second generation is created from that first generation. And sometimes second generation is positive, but it is often negative. And that's what you want. So if you have negative film in your collection, you might not know whether it's first or second generation. Sometimes it says right right on the box what you've got. But oftentimes, if you don't have any negative film, you're going to have to find who holds it, and the New York State Library website can help you identify who has master microfilm, and then you're going to want to have them make a copy of that for you. That is also negative. Does that help?
Okay,
Okay.
let's see.
Okay, so I think we're getting a lot of questions about this. So if I can simplify it. Okay, so you want to ideally digitize from negative film rather than positive film. And typically you're going to digitize from a negative film produced from the first generation negative film. So a vendor who can duplicate microfilm will take that first generation master and create a second generation master negative off of it. Okay, so copyright. So typically, the copyright of the original source material carries through to a reformatted version. I think where it gets a little complicated with some microfilm is because there are outfits. Was it UMI back in the day, ProQuest, that create microfilm and then copyright it from public domain resources. And I can't speak a lot about that. I have my own personal feelings about that. To me, there has been case law that says an exact duplication of a public domain work does not get a new copyright, if that helps you. Why not use the first generation? Because it's going to go through a machine and you don't want to ruin it. So the first generation film is it's the pristine copy that everything else is created off of. So you don't want to run that through microfilm scanning equipment.
Let's see. It looks like the next question is, would you handle digitizing and preserving large scrapbooks with news clippings in the same manner as large newspapers? In terms of preservation, it would be similar in some ways, but there's so many different types of materials involved in scrapbooks that it's sort of on a case-by-case basis. But if you do have a fragile scrapbook, keeping it in an archival book box is a good place to start. Jen, do you have any digitization suggestions for scrapbooks?
Scrapbooks are a bear.
Yeah, they're the hardest, I think,
Yeah,
of
they are
all.
the hardest.
Yeah.
Digitizing in the same manner as large newspapers. I mean, they're different because it's a scrapbook, so it's different. In terms, you can digitize them. I haven't personally done it, but I've worked with organizations who have. We certainly have digitized scrapbooks on our site. I just haven't personally scanned them myself.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of the issues that make scrapbooks challenging are sometimes when it's a mix of formats, it's really challenging. What do you do when you have brochures in there that have multiple pages? If you have one that's all clippings, sometimes, they're folded up
Right.
and they're on top of each other. So how do you present all of that? It's tough. And Grace, you and I know each other, so you can call me and we'll talk.
It's a good question though, because they're always completely unique. Each one's different from the other, so that is a good question.
I would recommend outsourcing and just telling them what you want. Like, I want every possible thing that can be viewed digitized, and then it's a matter of how you present that online.
Let's see. Storing newspaper articles, original format. One article per folder or a few articles per folder. So if you have the full newspaper, I would store each issue, excuse me, per folder when possible. Usually they're thick enough to where that will sort of take up one folder. If it's an exceptionally thin newspaper, like maybe more of I don't know, some sort of ephemera or local newspaper, workplace newspaper. In that case, you can use a sheet of buffered acid-free, lignin-free paper in between each one. But yeah, usually one issue of a newspaper, per folder, depending on the size of it, is good. Let's see. What do you recommend for resting staples attached to newspapers? Leave or remove? That's a good question. Um, in theory, you don't want any rusting metal in with your artifacts, but sometimes removing them can actually do more damage than just leaving them alone. So I tend to say that, if it's a full staple that goes through all the way to the back, it's going to be really difficult to get out. You might inadvertently do more damage, so I would just leave it alone. If that item is very special or important, a conservator can remove it pretty carefully. Or if the staple is not fully all the way through the paper, that's a different situation. But those can be tricky and they can leave rust stains. They can catch on things. So if it's a full staple, I would just leave it alone. Are there any other questions about? Oh, there's another one. Let's see. The cost of folders can be cost prohibitive when you have years worth of a daily newspaper. Can issues just be stacked in a drop front box? Or do you have another suggestion? Yeah, absolutely. You can stack them in a drop front box if if you can afford those very large folders. One thing you can do is to put, again, a sheet of acid-free, lignin-free buffered tissue paper or interleaving paper in between each issue. And you can usually get that by the roll and cut them, just cut sheets, which ends up being a lot cheaper. Or you can actually use that paper to make a folder. So you just cut a large enough piece, fold it in half, and that's a really cheap way to make a folder. But the really important thing in this situation is having that box for protection. I see more questions coming. Carol, are there special considerations for bound newspapers? Do you mean for digitization or do you mean for handling and storage? For storage and handling. Yeah, bound newspapers, they tend to be really large, and that binding is something to be concerned with. So just storing them horizontally on a shelf that's big enough is usually sufficient. You can put them into a book box if it's a very special bound newspaper. If you're experiencing red rot with the binding, it depends how old the binding is. That's an institutional decision, but that can be wrapped in acid-free, lignin-free buffered paper and tied with twill tape. For handling, again, you do have to support the full book because it is a very, very large book. So consideration has to be given to having a workspace for researchers that's large enough for it to be opened, and making sure that it's supported when it's opened. So basically, just treating it like a very large, fragile book is what you want to do. And they're currently in flat files. If you don't have anything else that needs that flat file space and the drawers are deep enough for those books, that's fine. You know, if you have a shelf that is large enough, you can store them on the shelf stacked no more than 3 high. I prefer to store, sort of oversized bound material flat rather than vertically. But if they're in flat files and you don't need that space, then that's fine for them to be in there. Okay, let's see. Dina, we're looking into our school newspapers, but can't be sure. Occasional things like syndicated comics, reprinted articles, etc., were originally cleared for copyright. Any suggestions? Jen, do you have any suggestions on that?
Um, No, because that is a question of kind of underlying rights. In talking to some other people who know, because I just asked a question very similar to this about yearbooks and about student newspapers and copyright, and if we should have any concerns about that. And I was told published is published, and so if it's pre 1923 or if it's or 1924, and then there's this gray area of between like 24 and 64, and then another gray area that goes to 79 or something, 76, where again, if those formalities weren't met, are they in the public domain? And some people would say yes. I don't know. I think you're right to be cautious, especially if it's syndicated stuff. I don't really have an answer for you, so I'm probably just going to keep babbling. Get some help from an intellectual property lawyer. Consult with them is what I would suggest if it's post 1924. I don't like giving copyright advice.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say
Not a lawyer.
that's way out of
Yeah.
my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have questions? And also, if questions occur to anybody, you can always contact Jen or myself, later on.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Okay. Oh, great. Um, well, thank you so much, Jen, for your expertise. I learned a lot, um, and that was terrific. And thank you everybody for attending. Please do contact us if you have any questions, and we'll be happy to help you out.
Yeah. Thanks, Gillian. Thanks, DHPSNY, and thank you all for coming. Good
Thanks. Have a good
times.
day, everyone. Take care. Yeah. Bye.